すいません、大山様、一旦マイクの方。
Guten Tag, mein Name ist Peter Anders. My name is Peter Anders and I'm the director of the Goethe Institute, the German Cultural Center. And we are very happy to host this symposium on media theory in times of Corona. And I wish to thank the Post-Media Research Network and especially Mōri Sensei. Today's event is part of a series of the Goethe Institute, which I would like to entitle Free Spaces for Free Art. We are opening up our spaces at no charge for those who belong to the most vulnerable groups hit by the coronavirus, the students and the self-employed artists. As International Cultural Institute, we are focusing on our affiliation with partner institutions and individual artists here in Japan, not just for online, but also for live events, respecting the necessary hygienic and security measurements. I believe that by doing so, we can overcome the burden of separation and isolation and can give back the arts and the academian life its eminent role that it has for our human imaginary. Thank you for your attention, and I hand over to Mōri Sensei, and I wish you a fruitful and thoughtful debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anders. And as was introduced, we will have this symposium on media and arts in the time of COVID-19. I am Yoshitaka Mōri from the Tokyo University of the Arts. I am here at the Goethe Institute, Tokyo, and our university, the Graduate School of Global Arts, GA for short, and also Goethe Institute together are organizing this symposium. So thank you once again to Mr. Anders and also Mr. Klein-san, and also people who are doing the lights, everybody from Goethe Institute. I would like to thank you all. And also the staff of the Tokyo University of the Arts, Kano-san, Shoji-san, Yamazaki-san, Hidaka-san, and others have helped us set up the stage and also prepare for this event. So thank you very much. Now, this symposium is being live streamed. This webinar is live streamed on YouTube. You can listen to it both in English and in Japanese. I believe if you are listening, it means you're having no problem at all. But if you do have any problems, I believe you can also watch this program from the Goethe Institute webpage. And we have two parts today. The first part is where we will hear from 3 presenters. And then in the second part, we will have another 3 presenters. This is done by using the Kakenhi grants from the Ministry of Education. So this is a part of a creative industry in our time. So first we have Professor Ito to make the first presentation. And today we have a lot to cover. So each person will have just 15 minutes for the presentation.
Hello, Professor Matthew Fuller, Professor Anthony Fung, and Professor Ōyama, Dr. Mizushima. Hello. It's so nice to see you today. My name is Mamoru Ito. I work at Waseda University. And today, the theme of my report is, as you can see on this slide, from communalities to conflicts, and from conflicts to communalities. That is my theme today. And I have to apologize. My report today will be made in Japanese. So, COVID-19 pandemic, including Japan, in Europe and the United States as well, all over the world. It is still expanding and continues to spread unabated. President Trump, he underestimated the pandemic and he left it unattended. And because of this, the US now has the largest number of cases in Europe, especially Britain, France, and Italy. They are also facing a second wave. In Japan today, each day brings about 1,500 to 1,800 new more cases. That's the situation. Now, this pandemic has revealed a variety of social problems that existed before COVID, and they are now becoming clear with a sense of urgency. I think that's what's happening. And there are several points I would like to touch on. First, in capital accumulation between industries, disparity is widening. GAFA and other communication capitalism leading digital industries, thanks to expansion of remote work, have earned huge profits. On the other hand, existing industries like transportation, retail, welfare, nursing care, tourism, and other industries, they have been hit immeasurably. In particular, in these existing industrial fields, SMEs and small companies have been seriously hit. And this is something that's common in all countries across the world. With neoliberalism under its impact, these existing disparities have become larger. Number 2, it goes without saying. Accompanying these disparities that I just mentioned, in labor markets there are layoffs. Dispatched workers are being terminated. There are employment disparities, wage disparities, and they are widening. In particular, in the past, there were low-wage workers like women, part-timers, non-regular dispatched workers, and also international students and technical intern trainees coming to Japan. So these are non-Japanese people working in Japan, and their employment situation has rapidly deteriorated. And this problem remains unattended. Nothing is being done. So you might say that pre-COVID serious problems are taking an even more severe turn. That's what this shows. There's the problem of class and the problem of ethnic minorities, and these are becoming more visible and are coming to the surface. This situation comes from GAFA and other global leading companies causing structural changes in capital accumulation. In other words, ITC global platforms have, over the past 20 years, changed the accumulation structure dramatically. That's the reason. In other words, ITC-based platforms have, for capital accumulation, become the main playing field. That's what this talks about. Thirdly, a change that we cannot overlook is, on a global scale, regarding ITC, there are geopolitical divisions and conflicts that are being born. That's something we cannot overlook. More specifically, between the US and China over ITC, the battle for hegemony, has become apparent. To compete with GAFA, the Chinese search site, Baidu, and Alibaba's Alipay, Tencent Holdings' WeChat, they have formed a giant market. And what's more, is it US or China? Over implementation as the main digital infrastructure in the battle for hegemony, a related clear example is the issue of Huawei's fifth-generation mobile communication system, or 5G networks. Number 4, with the spread of COVID-19, for preventive purposes, using AI technologies that have merged with digital technologies to collect and analyze big data on infection routes and contact with infected people for monitoring and tracking functions. This has now become socially acceptable. In China, reports say that in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, for surveillance of minority races to capture location data, surveillance smartphone apps have been implemented. Alibaba provides a social credit score service, Sesame Credit. Based on past history, users are scored between 350 and 950 points. If you score high, you enjoy benefits. That's the system that's being provided. And what's more, to prevent COVID-19 infection, Alipay introduced its Alipay Health Code on February 11th, in about 1 week. This spread to more than 100 cities. And this health code, based on input by users, shows the health condition of users using 3 colored QR codes. Green means that you can move around freely, and yellow means 1 week staying at home, and red means 2 weeks of self-quarantine at home. And this health code is checked when you ride public transport or when you enter a building. Behavior of individuals is tracked real time. That's the kind of social system that is now being formed. In South Korea, for contact tracking, what they used was data from credit card or debit card usage history, location data from mobile phone towers. And they also used what's said to be the more than 8 million or so security camera data. These trends, on a different level from GAFA-led global companies' big data analysis, marketing technology advances, on a different level from them, these are trends where companies and national governments cooperate and get the agreement of citizens. And they acquire hegemony to conduct their surveillance. I think that you can define these trends in this way. In Japan, there are calls for founding a digital agency. What will the organization be like? What kind of functions will it have? It's still unclear. But the risks of the government comprehensively and of collecting data on citizens is something we must be careful of. That's something that we need to watch. Number 5. As we saw in the US presidential elections, the digital media ecosystem is functioning as a major field of political conflict. That's the point that we are in now. However, on the other hand, the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. Under COVID-19, there are medical and welfare workers, and they face harsh working conditions, and movements by artists and ordinary citizens. To cheer them up, and as a field for spreading communalities and justice, digital networks are enhancing their raison d'etre, or reason for existence. So let me summarize the changes that I believe are worth noting. Number 1, as a major field of capital accumulation, ITC composition, and its geopolitical conflicts are becoming more serious. Number 2, as a new field for surveillance and tracking, artificial intelligence, AI, is being used and is expanding. Number 3, as a major field for political conflict, SNS or social media are coming to the foreground. And at the same time, number 4, as a field for expanding communalities, the importance of social media are getting even more important. In this way, conflicting digital media are the components. Digital media are the components of this uncertain ecosystem. So what I just mentioned, this situation, so to critically redefine the situation I just talked about, I'd like to propose 3 points for debate. So this is going to be a proposition of problems, and there are 3 of them. Number 1 that I'd like to mention is post-media or post-medium concepts. They were first put forward by Guattari and Manovich and Klaus, but even before they talked about this, the prefix post. This does not mean the end of mass media, such as television. It does not mean modernistic linear flow of time. And that is something we need to confirm. I believe that the prefix post carries the baggage of conventional media culture's controlling format or grammar, and yet new technologies and social organizations break the balance of media ecologies and its dynamics become even more fluid and even more uncertain. And that is the process that this refers to. That is something that we need to be aware of. From past to present, from present to future. This is not such a linear flow of time. The non-determination aspect of technology determination. This potentiality cannot be predicted at the time of actualization. Uncertain, unknown time is opened up. And this process, with time that is an anomaly, that is what we mean when we say post. That is how we should define it. And as I have already pointed out, the current capital accumulation structure changes and the geopolitical changes over ITC, and regarding surveillance technologies and citizens' awareness, there are dramatic changes. Over digital media, the historical changes are showing us both the meaning of crisis and opportunity, covered by the prefix post, and showing it in a very simple manner. That's what I believe. My second point for debate is the prefix post that I just talked about. From the context I just discussed means media studies should focus on the theme of abstract machine equals diagram versus energetic machines. We should define them this way, and to cope with mechanical enslavement as a social mechanical arrangement, Guattari's machine concept, that's something that we need to revisit. I believe this is important. In other words, Guattari's heterogenic system concept, or with past mediums, the process of self-differentiating. This process of self-differentiating and what I mentioned before, the non-determination to determination by Lamar. Those are keywords that Lamar is studying. So regarding this non-determination to determination, that's how Guattari defines technology. And his technology thinking, I believe, should be re-evaluated. And of course, Guattari's thinking was fully considered when Lamar wrote Anime Machine and when he wrote Anime Ecology. And what I discussed is, of course, connected to Lamar's studies perspectives. Lastly, the third theme. The third theme we should focus on is analyzing the data movement, distribution, and allocation process. This viewpoint, we need to analyze these more deeply. And this viewpoint, as infrastructure studies or as platform studies, has in media studies formed a certain field or area of study. However, what I wish to emphasize here is going back to more fundamental perspectives. In other words, Deleuze and Guattari pointed out the 3 points in the production process. 1, the connective synthesis. 2, the disjunctive synthesis. And number 3, the conjunctive synthesis. From these concepts, we should try to illuminate current changes. In particular, we need to focus on the disjunctive synthesis process related to the distribution, movement, and allocation of goods and data. In the past, goods and data's the point of consumption was illuminated by media studies. But we need to consider pre-consumption, we need to consider the diverse distribution channels and data moves before the point of consumption. In other words, the point of selection. That should be the main theme. And by considering this, the selection, access, behaviors, motivation, in other words, the unconscious emotion and effective responses, and provision of desire-related issues should be analyzed. In the short time I have, this may be insufficient as problem presentation, but with my presentation of 3 perspectives deemed important for post-media studies, I would like to end my report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ito. So you were the first presenter, and over the 4 years, we have had this post-media research network, and we have asked, well, you have talked about Felix Guattari and the concept of post-media. I think this came out in the 1980s, but even before the internet. And that concept, how can we rethink that in the era of the internet? I believe that is the starting point. And also, as we look at the current situation with President Trump in the United States, and him failing for re-election, and looking at the tension between the internet and TV, we see very new politics happening. So then, how should we consider the media in all of this? It's not just a problem of the United States. I believe similar things are happening here in Japan and in UK, where Professor Matthew Fuller is, and also Hong Kong, where Professor Anthony Fung is, may be a very unique area. It caused us to rethink all of this. So now the second presenter will be Dr. Tomoko Shimizu from the University of Tsukuba. And she was also a member of the research network for a very long time, and today she will be talking about portraits in the post-Anthropocene. I think she will be talking about digitizing facial recognition and other things. But thank you very much. And oh, I see. And I think we have to wait until the personal computer is ready. And yes, it's ready now. So please, the floor is yours. Nope, the screen is not ready yet. Well, we are talking about post-media, and still we are struggling with the use of media. Yes, here we go. And so the PowerPoint is in Japanese, but also there is English translation. So I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm Shimizu from the University of Tsukuba. And from my side, I will talk about the portraits of post-Anthropocene, the lessons on digitizing facial appearance and boundaries. I would like to point out 3 issues here. The first one is the pre-corona society's vulnerability and post-Anthropocene, meaning that people are no longer a dominant actor on the geologically defined Earth, and things that we should think in that aspect. And secondly is post-human virus and the new normal. And the third point is the digital media era and facial appearances and the possibility of art. So I'd like to first talk about my first point. So before coronavirus, what was the normal society? Under COVID-19, I believe that became very clear. And then what is society? Well, society is where uncertainty is distributed unevenly, and there is a separation between those who are worth living and those who are not. Also, we see that the structures and essential workers that are keeping our lives going, like the healthcare, nursing care, education, and all these things are basically carried out by women. And now we are able to see what has been invisible in the past. And we are now trying to go back to normalcy. However, are we going back to the society that is awake 24/7, or the normal life where we were chased around by bullshit jobs? Are we really going back to that? We need to rethink this. In this new liberal society, in the competitive society under that, everything is put into numbers and everything is looked at within the monetary exchanges. We are competing with others and we are measuring against each other. And so if you are seen unworthy, then you will be left behind and you will be isolated in that society. But we probably were deprived of our imagination for the others, or maybe within the economic system, as David Graeber says, we have forgotten the way we take care of one another. And that is why, under the risk of COVID-19, rather than looking at the relationship with others, we tended to lean on the power of the state or social control and try to justify all that. And on the other hand, we are the media for viruses, potentially. And so when we say social distancing, what do we mean by social? So you want to help yourself, you want to keep yourself healthy, but you also want to care for others, which has led us to rethink about ourselves and our relationship with the society. It's not just about the risk of the individual, it's the collective risk. And our subjectivity is not individualized, it's more public. It's about the public infection that may be possible. We have to shift this epidemiological social view. And we have to combine that together with the governance of the state. Now, President Macron of France said that the virus is the enemy of humankind, and we have to win this war against the virus. But biologist Shinji Fukuoka has said that the virus is an essential part of our life, and therefore it is not possible to eradicate it or eliminate it totally. I believe we should listen to his words. And Zizek said that when nature is attacking us with viruses, it is in a way sending our own message back to us. The message is, what you did to me, I am now doing to you. So we have realized once again through COVID-19 that our bodies are the dwelling place for viruses, and there are not just one but multiple conditions of life, which has been self-evident, however, which were invisible. And as Timothy Morton said, it's not about individual survival, but it's about being alive together. So we are required to foster a sense of care for the place that has supported us. So human-type viruses, human versus nature, it's not this dichotomy. We have to think about places in between as well. And also, do not take the time and space of human being. We have to also look at the existences that are non-human and try to take this as an opportunity to create a new social reality. So be it human or non-human, we need to rethink the relationship and also try to care for each other. So that is my first point. My second point, in the post-human virus and the new normal. So this COVID-19, what is this coronavirus? Catherine Hayes said that the new coronavirus, in two senses, is a post-human virus. The one is that despite humans' intentions, desires, or motivations, it is acting. And also, when you think about evolution, people and this new coronavirus has taken opposite strategies in evolution. People have become more complex in its cognitive skills. We have language. We also have developed social structures. We now have advanced technologies like AI, and we have become advantageous within the niche of evolution. However, the virus has become more simple as it evolved. It took over the cell machine, and by making its genome much smaller than the cell, they are reproducing very rapidly. Hale says that these two seems very opposite, but the very simplistic evolution of virus took a very complex process. So this is not a dichotomy between humans versus virus. It is something that we need to understand through new concepts, new vocabulary, new methods. And she's talking about humans as species in common, where you have the differences among human beings, however, emphasizing the commonalities as humans, and species in biosymbiosis, which is where different species infiltrate and blend together. And species in cybersymbiosis is about technology and AI actively cooperating with humans to create a new world for us to share. So she is talking about these three things. And right now, I am trying to, it seems that this is being deepened, but Hales actually, this perspective by Hales was actually taken up by Benjamin Bracton in his project, The New Normal. In the theme for 2019 for his project was algorithmic governance, inverse uncanny valley, and human exclusion zone. Algorithmic governance is about using all kinds of apps and IoT computer which will affect us, and based on that assumption, what kind of new cities, buildings, and cultures should we design? That is being questioned. In inverse uncanny valley, it looks at ourselves through the eyes of machines, and what's important here is the human perspective. How can we change that? And the third one, human exclusion zone, is about AI and robots. As they evolve, you have these large automated factories and places like Chernobyl and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant where humans have been excluded. Looking at the conditions and contexts and investigating that, we want to once again reflect on the human-centered designs. Also, he is now looking at climate change and environmental issues where places are becoming inhabitable, and he is trying to consider how to make the Earth habitable again. That it is the terraforming of the Earth. And today, I will not be able to talk about everything, so I would like to just focus on Blatton's 18 lessons of quarantine urbanism, and one is new masks. He says masks are both expressive and functional, and they signal our personalities with the epidemiological, immunological comments, or communicate solidarity with the epidemiological, immunological comments. And Agamben has said that faces are unique to people, and faces are essential for political communication. The face is the place for politics. So if we are to wear face mask in public, it means the death of politics. But Breton says that masks are among the humanity's most ancient and accomplished art forms. Masks in Latin is persona. That is the origin of the words personality in English. So the persona, the mask that has been used in Greek mask theater, the mask and what is behind it, and it is thinking about what comes in between that. And also on the stage of theater, it appears there and it is playing a role. So, for example, people and human and unhuman, things that are invisible, people are trying to provide a face to that so that we can have exchange. And I think we have been trying to look at that from folklore as well as science. So how do we try to have this exchange between the others? Now, thirdly, is about digital media and the faciality and the possibility of art. So I have looked at masks and faces, but in the digital media world, faces without masks have now started to take new meaning and functions. Under social distancing, our faces are being trapped within the computer screen, and it is put into the standardized frame in Zoom. And so all kinds of digital tools are being used to make faces into simple information. Deleuze and Guattari in said that faces, what is making faces unique? They looked at the system. Face is abstract, and because of that, you have this dichotomy between faces and landscape, and that is the power machine, according to them. So you are just separating the face from the body, and the face is codified, and so the face appears alone, and that is an arrangement of power. And with the development of media, this has changed. Faces made by media has been categorized in the past as well. And now we are seeing some new developments in the age of digital. Pre-coronavirus, there was something like digital phrenology. For example, in 2016 at the Shanghai Jiaotong University, Shaolin Yu and Si Chan took 1,126 ID photos of non-criminal people from the web and also utilized 730 convicted criminals' ID photos from law enforcement and fed it into a neural network. They have been criticized, but what I want to focus here is that they said AI does not have bias like human beings, and therefore they will not be affected by bias that is codified in society. Therefore, they will be able to make a fairer judgment. They emphasize the neutrality of machine learning. However, James Bridle is saying that technology also has this ghost of human bias. So the AI is not perfect, rather, it perfectly reflects the codified bias of human beings. So, because of its perfection, AI has this error. And there are several art forms that are interesting from this perspective. The first one is error, the art of imperfection. That was the theme in 2018 in Ars Electronica, and the work of entitled Normalizing Machine. The norms of society or normality has been put into an image, and this has been analyzed in this interactive installation. So you can see in this photograph, the right-hand side, people who stands in front of it. People are to select which looks more normal. So you have a choice among two, and the more normal image will be fed into the algorithm image. The machine learning will automate Beltion's verbal portrait, and so the normal concept of normal will be visualized, the concept of normal held by the participants, and you will also be able to see what's happening inside the black box of the AI. The structure of norm and normal will be visualized through this practice. And in 2019, at the Venice Biennale, in the Taiwan Pavilion, Xu Li Chen had an installation called 3 by 3 by 6. And this was also one way of escaping the norm and abstract. There were 6 surveillance cameras, and the building used to be a prison, and a surveillance room was made through this, and this was an effort to hack into the panopticon. And people like Casanova, Assad, Foucault, and other sexual criminals, altogether 10 of them, their video portraits were put into the panopticon and were projected onto the tower. And then 3D cameras will take data from the participants who step inside the building. So everything is made transparent within this building. The gender, sexuality, race, everything is put into cultural codes, and they will be reloaded into the biopolitical bank that includes the 10 criminal sexual offenders. And here, Paul B. Preciado, who was the curator, called this panopticon not surveillance, but surveillance. Surveillance is, of course, the eye that is necessary for a panopticon, but this is done from the top, from those in power. But surveillance is about utilizing smartphones and computers. It's a more horizontal structure using more vulnerable devices. And participants can access this from the outside and also add on top of this. So the prison with AI and internet, it has changed into a different surveillance space. And this is actually showing a fictional space which is disobedient against the norms of gender, race, and others. So this means that people are not subordinates of technology. It's about how do we face the past of technology so that we can create a new vision toward the future for norms. Now, digital images, how are they created, shared, and archived? Hito style, inspired by Monty Python, he came up with a work called How Not to Be Seen, the fucking don't be seen, the fucking educational move file. So not being seen is quite repressional, but it's also very liberating. It's showing this in a very critical and humorous way. Also, we see some great changes occurring. Media environmentalist Yuka Kubo talks about Japanese girls using digital apps to change their facial appearances in their images. She calls this Cinderella technology. It's not just about showing a different appearance, but it is like translating the form using errors with imperfection. So the identity is manipulated artificially. So from the real expression of face, the girls are withdrawing from that, and they are using digital media for their use as communication tools. So digital images, as Lev Manovich says, several mediums are coexist together, and sometimes the border among them become very vague, and it's as if a new life form is being created. That is the medium, and everything is now becoming digitalized, and therefore you have the real self, the digital self. Each has a role to play, and also you are playing the persona as you create a new personas. Politics and art is like the relationship, the two forms that create fiction, as Rancière said. According to him, reality is the object of fiction. Reality itself doesn't exist. You have the dominant fiction and fiction by consent. And through all that, reality is trying to negate that they are fiction. So what we see, what we say, what we can do, and through that we are trying to create a new landscape. And Lancière says that the essence of politics is not consensus but the census. And Carl Schmitt, it's not about Carl Schmitt's foe and friend. We are trying to create an encounter of some things that don't meet, see, or hear, accept what cannot be accepted, count what cannot be counted. So we are trying to realign the division of sensual and sharing. So I have talked about human-centered time, speed, norm, benchmarks, and other standards being rejected and seeking multiple times and diversity in a non-scalable situation. It is about creatively recombining the mutual relationship, and at stake here is the new wisdom in the era of digital media. Thank you very much.
So I believe we will be receiving some comments in the second half. So we will move on to Professor Mizushima for now. The identity, the digital age, and face, and politics using masks. These are all important topics that we all are interested in. So Professor Mizushima from Osaka Sangyo University is joining us virtually from Osaka. So Professor Mizushima, the floor is yours. Can you hear me? Yes. Then let me share my screen. Is everything okay? Let me begin. I apologize. The Goethe Institute and the Tokyo University of the Arts and interpreters, everyone, thank you very much. I have a great sense of appreciation to everyone, but since the time is limited, I'd like to begin my presentation. Tokyo 2020 and the neo-viralism. As the threat and crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic spread around the world, a scene from the iconic 1988 Japanese anime Akira, set in Neo-Tokyo in the year 2019, suddenly attracted attention on the social networking service platform and other media. That's the scene where the sign reads 147 days until the games, and underneath the sign, the graffiti reads, "Just cancel it." This scene from the anime movie more than 30 years ago, and it spread virally online as a prophecy suggesting the cancellation or postponement of the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games, with mixed effects of anxiety and fear of an unknown virus. With February 28th, marking exactly 147 days until the opening ceremony on July 24th, and talk of the possibility of canceling the games due to the novel coronavirus growing as the outbreak spreads in Japan, the topic, "Just cancel it," was trending at the top of Japanese Twitter. The 2020 Games has been promoted based on the open lie of under control of Fukushima, which was invoked by former Prime Minister Abe in his bid speed for the Olympics. And the Games 2020, in conjunction with the recent necroeconomics policy, such as Go To campaign, which is cheered by a chorus of letting die or exposing to death, is still hanging in the air, waiting for the open lie of under control of the COVID-19. Philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy coined the term neo-viralism, transcribing the economic and social neoliberalism on the sanitary plane. According to Nancy, this neo-viralism is motivated by a resentment through and through, and at the slightest sign of new forms of solidarity, social demands, and desires, it is quick to take revenge and crush them. What the neo-viralism wants are only free enterprise and free exchange, including the free exchange with the virus. And it wants such liberties in response to the call to turn the economy around, and sinks into a state of nihilism and barbarism that cannot be masked by the name of such liberties. As suggested by recent events inspired by a scene from the Akira movie more than 30 years ago, Tokyo 2020, labeled as the Reconstruction Olympics, and now suspended in the mid-air, increasingly appears to be emerging as the spectacle of disintegration, fit for the era of neo-viralism, namely, as the spectacle that survives on the spread of infection and feeds on the destruction of nature, climate change, resource depletion, and all the other catastrophes, except the liberties that neo-viralism lasts for. 2. Pandemic media and platform. COVID-19 is the first pandemic that can be accessed through a smartphone. Most of the networked world is connected to the flow of information about the spread of infectious diseases, and people continue to spread and circulate information and effects through social media, opening their smartphone apps to keep up with the constantly changing news, statistics, and predictions. Moreover, through the COVID-19, we must keep in mind that smartphones are increasingly being used as a monitoring system to support public health management and control, and that they are being integrated into the media environment that accelerates the shift. Let me give you prominent recent examples. In China, the use of the Alipay health code system, developed by the giant e-commerce Alibaba to prevent the spread of infection, has become widespread and integrated into Alipay's city services function. It is also well documented that other countries have also widely adopted contact tracing apps. We can see at least two trends from these examples. One is the tendency for digital media technologies to be deployed more widely, minutely, and deeply as an integral part of the state of emergency and new normal. And the other is the tendency for platforms owned by giant tech companies to increasingly function as social infrastructures that combine functions such as monitoring, management, and control. Of course, these developments are bound to raise a number of concerns and objections. How much liberty and privacy are we willing to provide through the use of smartphones and other devices? Is it not likely that the degree of surveillance capitalism based on social control becomes stronger and stronger? Wouldn't the expansion of viral testing provide an impetus for big data biopolitics based on the collection of vast number of data, and so on? However, COVID-19 may force a reconsideration of these sets of questions and force a change in the way the problem is set up. The current crisis may provide an opportunity to re-examine the old analytical perspective, which tended to automatically criticize sensing and modeling technologies as bad from the top of its head as leading to surveillance and social control, and to question that libertarian perspective in today's new media environment. Let me draw on a suggestion from design theorist Benjamin Bratton. He points out it is a mistake to reflexively interpret all forms of sensing and modeling as surveillance, and all forms of active governance as social control. We need a different and more nuanced vocabulary. In fact, the libertarian principle of anonymity, which criticizes and rejects viral testing and tracing as surveillance, involves an ethical and political choice to be willing to endanger vulnerable populations at high risk of infection and death, along with a choice to value individual liberty. In the midst of a global pandemic crisis, perceiving sensing, tracing, and modeling technologies as surveillance, panopticon, and capture through biopolitics will inevitably be criticized as short-sighted. Of course, it is not important to contrast the critical view of surveillance is bad with the uncritical view of surveillance is good. Rather, we need a more nuanced vocabulary to analyze how the mode of operation of surveillance and control is changing. And this point needs to be discussed more openly in various fields, including media studies. As the ubiquity of sensing and tracing mechanism, the expansion of telework and online classes, and the rise of delivery and the streaming services have clearly shown, the COVID-19 is interconnected with devices and platforms that implement various digital technologies. We can call these new environments and arrangements pandemic media. From a pandemic media perspective, media studies, which have tended to focus on the platforms that deliver media content, needs to take into account the mediating functions of the aforementioned platforms across multiple sectors and their social infrastructuralization. Notably, the pandemic platform like Amazon, which ramped up its revenue after the COVID-19, as one person close to the company puts it, is now presenting itself as the new Red Cross. However, what concerns us here is the unequal relationship between essential services and the experience of convenience, and how this notion of convenience generates risk and exposure for those who work to produce it. With this in mind, media researcher Mark Steinberg and others make a straightforward point. Platforms plus crisis equals inequality. That is, pandemic platforms produce convenience for some, hazard for others, and financial consolidation for elites. Does the situation surrounding pandemic media inevitably lead to the further expansion of such inequality? In other words, the Amazonization of the planet-scale economy by large online platform companies? Or are there still potentialities for securing the new transparency about data use and for the individual and collective reappropriation of monopolistic platforms, and even for constructing a planetary scale platform infrastructure that redefines the public and co-creates the common? 3, this is the last section, masks and collectivity. The list of pandemic media does not include only those related to digital media technologies as we have analyzed so far. We need to add to it the classic and analog media of masks. Anti-infection masks and surgical masks that were in short supply after the epidemic, protective masks from forest fires caused by climate change, and military gas masks, masks worn by activists to circumvent facial recognition systems, and masks worn to mark a collection of resisting bodies from Zapatistas to Anonymous and Pussy Riot and more. Thus, a mask, a device that covers nose and mouth, can be viewed as a multi-layered media that mediates tensions and conflicts between self and other, contact and distancing, public and private, identification and obscuration, power and resistance, individuality and collectivity, as well as contagion and immunity. Especially after the corona pandemic, masks have become an important element of pandemic media and a major point of contention on a global scale. For example, many Chinese students in the UK have been forced to make a bad choice between fear of racism associated with wearing masks, and anxiety or fear of infection associated with not wearing masks, because wearing masks in public spaces is a target of racist and xenophobic attacks. In the United States, President Trump and his supporters railed against masks and flaunted mask phobia that echoed the liberties desired by the neo-viralism and continued to practice its non-use for a long time. In Japan, partly because wearing a mask has already become a social habit, the mask phobia movement was not as blatant as in the West. On the contrary, a movement known as the self-restraint police has emerged, attacking and cracking down on those who don't wear face masks or don't follow social distancing. Media researcher Masaaki Ito sees in this movement a unique pressure created by the overlap between the peer pressure inherent in a pre-modern village society and the survival pressure inherent in a neoliberal market society. If we incorporate this perspective into our analysis, we can point out that although at first glance mask phobia and self-restraint police appear to be opposed to each other, they are in fact identical in that they both pursue a personal liberty that is compatible with the liberty desired by neoliberalism, neo-viralism. The spread of the COVID-19 endangers the health and lives of vast numbers of people and threatens the very existence of the healthcare system. In that sense, COVID-19 is nothing more than a threat to our life in the common. In other words, the ongoing pandemic can be seen as revealing the vulnerability and insecurity of the common, as well as highlighting the need for the care of it. We can therefore rethink the mask as a pandemic media to mediate the care of the common beyond the personal liberty that is compatible with neoliberalism and neo-viralism. Moreover, the care of the common is not limited to resilience, which is primarily concerned with the personal survival, recovery, and restoration, but is linked to a collective resistance aiming for a radical structural change. We can see examples of the use of masks as a media to mediate collective resistance activity involving the care of the common. In the two recent movements that have developed across the COVID-19 pandemic. One is the movement of the mask-wearing feminists that began last October in Chile and inspired a general strike on March 9th of this year. During the movement, a workshop was held to collaborate on the production of red masks of resistance, in which women helped each other to sew up colorful masks. One of the participants said the following: "The masked women do not expose their face because they fear that they might be recognized. It's about not representing an individual. Their face is your face is my face. This is everyone's protest, and each one of us, both physically and ideologically, live in a space of resistance." The other is the Black Lives Matter movement, which was rebooted in the midst of the pandemic against the institutional racism and the penal state regime that had been built into American society as a structural system. The London-based artist collective, the Otolith Group's latest video work on the life during the pandemic shows a Black female activist from the BLM movement wearing a mask that reads, "Racism is a virus." As this message suggests, the BLM movement aims to transform radically the racist society as a whole while deepening the political method of intersectionality and the masks worn by the participants can be seen as a media for the collective resistance involving the care of the common. In this presentation, we have taken up the Tokyo 2020 platforms and masks as the main subjects of analysis, and have considered the media and collectivity in the age of neo-viralism. We hope that the symposium, whose common theme is media and arts in the time of COVID-19, could be interwoven in the perspective of an investigation of collectivity involving the care of the common. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mizushima. Masks have been appearing in the presentations. And in Japan, everyone is wearing a face mask. And Aoi started using masks to express ambivalence under COVID-19. And I was thinking of taking a break. However, we have fallen behind schedule. So let's continue. Let's move on to part 2. And then after that, we can ask Ōyama-san to be MC. So I think maybe I should speak and we should end part 1. And then we'll move on to Dr. Matthew Fuller and then Professor Anthony Fung under Professor Ōyama's MCing. Is that all right? Okay. In that case, I will move a little bit. And Mori will make his presentation. And we're running a little short of time, so I will try to skip parts of my presentation. Right. So I will try to keep it short. And I apologize to the interpreter. I'll probably skip number 3. So post-humanism and ecology. But today, what I want to talk about is, rather than formulate some coherent theme, it's more of an attempt to map out the current state of the art and media landscape. And broadly, I'm going to talk about 5 major issues, and they are the notion of state of emergency and social turn in art, and post-humanism and ecology. I will skip those because there's a lot of overlap of what's been said before. And we've actually already shared this, so I'll skip those. And lastly, I'll talk about capitalism or post-capitalism. So I prepared 5, but I will narrow it down to 3 and talk about those. And at the risk of being a bit patterned, I'd like to quote from Walter Benjamin. He talks about the thesis of the philosophy of history. And he says, the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency which we live in is not the exception, but the rule. We must attain to a concept of history that's in keeping with this insight. So the first question we have to ask is, for whom is the new coronavirus? Oh, my slides are not moving.
通にパワーポイント開けちゃダメなの？うん。あ、これで言ってますね。すいません。
Okay, good. Excuse me.
続きを読みます。
So let me continue.
というか私たちが考えなきゃいけないのは、
So what we have to think about is, for whom is the new coronavirus a state of emergency? As Carl Schmitt and Agamben have pointed out, a state of emergency is a political condition demanded by undemocratic or extrajudicial powers, particularly in post-9/11 and post-2000 politics, to reinforce biopower, policing, surveillance, and administrative power. The state of emergency has been used as an excuse regularly. In a sense, the state of emergency has become the norm. On the other hand, we should make sure that even in a normal state of emergency, there are people living in even more exceptional circumstances. They are immigrants, refugees, foreign workers, LGBTQ, the underclass, homeless people, disabled, sex workers, and all kinds of precariats, various other minorities, and socially and economically vulnerable groups. They've been marginalized and excluded by mainstream politics. For these people, even before COVID-19, the state of emergency had already started. The novel coronavirus may have made previously latent problems visible or have expanded them to a scale that can no longer be resolved. From this point of view, if today's emergency is indeed an emergency, it's not a matter of reconfiguring the present into a new way of life, but rather it's a matter of envisioning an alternative way of life through the perspective of those who have lived in the past and are still living in the present in a state of emergency. And it seems to me that from the perspective of people who have been marginalized and excluded from society, economics, history, and geography, we can explore the everyday life. In the meantime, if the art of the state of emergency is to be found in such a practice, it may be a form of another alternative way of life. And when we think about art here, I'd like to mention that the form of contemporary art has changed significantly since the 1990s. In the 1970s, post-Fordism regime became the dominant mode of production, and works of art became dematerialized, specifically from paintings and sculptures and other forms that could be housed in museums and galleries. We moved to conceptual art, land art, video art, media art, and bodily expressions. So there was an increase in immaterial artworks. In the 1980s, the end of the Cold War structure and the onset of globalization led to an influx of non-Western art that did not fall within the conventional norms of Western art. And this non-Western art expanded the framework of art, critiquing Western, modernist, and progressivist histories, artist-centeredness, and the imperialist tendencies of art, and represented by museums and art galleries. One of the most distinctive of these is what Claire Bishop called the social turn trend since the 1990s. And Nicholas Brio has relational aesthetics, and the growing interest in socially engaged art, participatory and community art have responded to these trends, even though with different emphases. I think you can say that. And since the 2000s, Japanese art projects can be understood as a development of these trends in Japan. Especially in Japan, various projects have been born in connection with development projects, such as community town revitalization. From Kitagawa's initiative projects, such as Echigo Tsumari Art Triennale and Setoji Triennale, are typical examples. And the Tokyo Biennale, which was supposed to be held this year, it will be held next year, but this kind of urban type project. This may be another example. In any case, these art projects aim to form networks and communities rather than material works of art by entering the region and forming human relationships. In particular, they have been directly involved in social issues such as declining birth rates, aging, and depopulation. The major impact of the novel coronavirus is that it has made it difficult to make art after the social term, especially art that's about human networks, communities, and relationships. It's made it very difficult. In particular, older people are also at risk of infection, and the very nature of social art has been challenged. More specifically, in order to advance social art projects, artists are forced to engage more fully with issues such as infrastructure, medicine and public health, the environment, transportation, the media technology that used to shape our lives. Post-coronavirus art takes the social turn to another level. And this is forcing a major change in the traditional art form. And I wanted to talk a little bit about ecology, but I'm short of time, so I'll move on to the issue of capitalism. So I'd like to think about new coronavirus and capitalism and art. And I was preparing this paper on Tuesday, November the 10th. The Nikkei stock average reached its highest level since the bursting of the bubble economy in the 1990s. It's true, the GDP has fallen, and there are industries in crisis such as food and beverage and the airline industry. However, there are also industries doing well, such as communications and medical, and the economic system of capitalism as a whole is slowly recovering while restructuring. Naomi Klein talks about the Green New Deal, and I don't know the extent to which the Japanese industry will benefit, but at a minimum, as with the Great East Japan earthquake and the accidents after that, epidemics like the new coronavirus do not necessarily have a major impact on capitalism itself. However, to go back to the discussion at the beginning, the state of emergency brought about by COVID-19 has brought to light a problem that existed in the first place, like part-time workers and the precariats, freelancers, including many women and foreign workers. They have lost their jobs and they are now living in poverty. Unique to Japan, the country's high suicide rate. Internationally, Japan's suicide rate was quite high to start with, but compared to last year, these past few months, the suicide rate has been steadily rising. And when it comes to the poverty of workers, the world of culture and arts is no exception. Scheduled concerts, exhibitions and art festivals have been cancelled. Many people are out of work, financially distressed. Many artists and other workers in the art world are on the brink of not being able to continue working in the art world. Because they're making a living by doing side jobs outside of art. And it's not to say that the government is offering no support, but the effect is limited. And if COVID-19 continues next year, the economic infrastructure that supported the arts may collapse. And one interesting attempt is works like Save Our Life, like we have here, but how far can they go? It's unclear. And one interesting attempt is to quit the costly city life and move to rural areas to explore an alternative lifestyle. And through remote work, that is one possibility that may be viable. And contemporary artist Koki Tanaka, in a recent talk, actually this is with me and with Professor Shimizu, between the three of us, and he said that people like him, artists like him, are like healthcare workers. What he's saying is, usually artists are independent, they have an established ego, and they try to express themselves. They have modern, independent ways of expressing themselves. However, there are other artists. More specifically, they try to build a relationship with those around them, continuously examine these relationships to create something better. So these are like mutually dependent artists. And Tanaka-san was saying that he feels potential in the latter, and he thinks that's what he will be doing in the future. And if you had to say, artists' practices, there's an overlap with what caregivers do. Earlier on, I talked about suicide, and in particular, capitalism places a burden mentally. So as care workers, artists may have to function. That is a possibility we need to consider. And it's linked to what I said in the beginning. Medicine and other care logics and art, or medicine itself, may be intertwined with art. That's a kind of a post-coronavirus essential worker. So that may be the new role of artists. However, the central players may be those not in the world of art, but people who were essential workers in medicine or people who were marginalized in society before. But at the same time, this is a possibility. So far, I have outlined the state of emergency under Corona, the social turn in art, and post-humanism and capitalism. Well, I didn't talk too much about post-humanism and ecology. Maybe I can discuss this later. And as I said at the beginning, these are all intertwined. And in fact, they represent a single, continuous, and united way of looking at the world. At the beginning, I talked by quoting Benjamin, and he actually goes on to say, then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism. That is what Benjamin had to say. And there are forces that want to use the state of emergency as an opportunity to introduce 21st century fascism. I regret to say they exist. This happens in Europe and probably in Japan and in the United States. It's widely seen in industrial countries. And with the new capitalism and authoritarian state and this new media technology working hand in hand to form this new fascism, that's the 21st century new fascism, it seems that, and I want to borrow what Benjamin has to say, but art needs to be politicized even more. And with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you very much.
So we call this a post-media research network, and still we are having a lot of problems with media. But in any case, we are trying this in this bilingual format, connecting with London as well as Hong Kong and Osaka and Tokyo as well as Kyoto. So we are connecting 5 different points. And we have done it ourselves. But I think going through these accidents are also part of the fun. Now, moving on, we'd like to go to London. And we have asked 2 people for keynote speeches. One is Professor Matthew Fuller from the University of London Goldsmiths College, and the other person is Professor Anthony Fung from Chinese University of Hong Kong. Both are very important researchers for me and also old friends, and they have been researching and publishing a lot of ideas, and I have been hoping to listen to them, and I'm hoping that we can share later on in the discussion. So now I'd like to ask Professor Matthew Fuller for his presentation.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to everyone, and apologies, I don't have a PowerPoint to show. I hope this my face won't be too scary, but at least you can imagine it's a mask. What I want to do is talk to a paper that has been very kindly translated by Yoshitaka Mōri already, which is available via the Google Drive that's been presented. And what I want to do is kind of probably pick up some of the kind of connections that have been made around ecology, particularly, but also some of the kind of questions around novel forms of governance that are introduced by computational media and by software systems. I'd like to thank the organizers and everyone presenting. It's really been extremely interesting morning here. So I've been taking a lot of notes and learned a lot already. I hope I can kind of make a contribution to this. My paper that has been made available and kindly translated, as I've said, is it builds on some work that's been developed with E.L. Weitzman of Forensic Architecture, also at Goldsmiths. And we're trying to think about in what we're calling investigative aesthetics. So in the way in which artists, architects, and others develop means of investigating human rights abuses, ecological crimes, state violence, and so on. But what we're trying to do with this is to try and think about, in relationship to forensic knowledge, we can say that everything in the world acts as a kind of sensor. Everything in the world acts as something that embodies a kind of memory of events. So whether it's a building that breaks down when a missile lands on it, or whether it's the tracks left in the soil by tanks moving across a landscape, or whether it's a pollution sensor registering the levels of a certain chemical. We're interested in thinking about distributed forms of sensing and sense making. So we want to assert aesthetics as a process of sensing and sense making. So within this, I've set out at the kind of beginning of the text some of these ideas, and then we want to move on to some propositions for thinking about the present epidemic and how this kind of hyper aesthetic, this kind of ramified notion of aesthetic in which everything is actively sensing, might allow us to think the epidemic in certain ways. So I have three propositions to make. Firstly, that thought experiments rather than propositions in a way. The French post-impressionist Camille Pissarro, who called himself a painter of cabbages, might be one unlikely source for thinking about the present. Pissarro's aesthetic concerns were complex, but often had to do with exemplifying an egalitarian mode of perception in which the picture plane is not swamped by heroic forms or significant individuals, but by the play of sunlight on entities in the world, and how that might entail the formation of a view. In Pissarro's paintings, light spreads angularly but evenly, whilst also intersected by moisture in the air, the relative capacity of surfaces to reflect light, and the affordances of the painting moment and the painting subject and materials as they rework light into strokes, dabs, and touches of oil paints. Can we imagine an aesthetic of seemingly humble objects such as viruses rather than cabbages? What does it mean to work with submicroscopic entities and their perceptions of the world? Working on the layers of translation and mediation introduced by the media by which we know them, from microscopes to pandemic tests to dashboards displaying the international statistics of the epidemic. How might these be coupled with the experience of undergoing that disease demands and inflicts? How might we make sense of or with the epidemic in a way that brings all aspects of it forward, rather than replicating the state thinking that predominates? A reversioning of Pissarro might, for instance, take his approach from the point of view of the cabbages, the cells of its leaves, or a virus affecting them. Think of the post-human condition, encourage us to try and find ways of adequately recognizing the agency of the non-human. Part of this will be in recognizing their aesthetics. What modes of sensing and sense-making are entailed for the coronavirus? Do we need to learn a viral view of the world? We might start by observing that whilst this may not be the best of all possible worlds, it is one that, as entropy increases due to ecological damage, is perhaps momentarily becoming so for viruses. The second kind of inquiry. The novelist Arundhati Roy famously described the epidemic as a portal, an opportunity to enter another mode of futurity, to open up other ways of organizing the world. In this, she meant that contemporary forms of economy and governance, the cultural habituations to what is seen and not seen, what is taken into account and what is considered to be featureless, have an opportunity to change or to be broken with. Crisis allows for some moments of perception to take place as people confront the inadequacy and stupidity of certain taken for granted norms. As mentioned by Tomoko Shimizu in her talk, this is a primarily ecological condition, one where ecology is a kind of superset in which media is a part. Art takes part in this condition, partly since it is both inside and outside of this ecological condition. It is deeply implicated in culturally sustaining and providing an asset class for the deadly economic ecological paradigm in which we inhabit. As part of this, art entails systemic precarity for the majority of people working in relationship to it, even systemic disconnection from mechanisms of valuation. At the same time, it's tasked with thinking outside of those terms and conditions, and it is in this regard that it also forms part of the portal that Arundhati Roy speaks about. Capitalism is devouring the carbon uptake capacity of ecologies that could sustain futures, pumping out more carbon on the one hand and destroying forests and oceans on the other is a suicidal endgame. The present epidemic is a prelude from which we can hopefully learn and make a detour. At current rates of carbon production, we have 8 years to stay within the IPCC target, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change target of 2 degrees raise in climate temperature. Aesthetic sense-making can enable us to chart a path through this portal that recognizes the unfolding of the crisis of climate within that of the epidemic. Both are facets of the same ecological devastation. One way art can chart a path through this portal is by rendering forms of sense-making that attempt to become adequate to this condition. As a species, it's systematically hard for humans to see beyond the ends of their noses. Harder still when they're hooked into multiply interlocking systems of gratification, punishment, incapacitation, and reward of the kinds that contemporary capitalism offers. Forms of sensing and sense-making, that is aesthetics, that in a non-sentimental way address this condition and what may lie beyond it are needed. Artists that work with ecological formations, but that recognize these in terms that are also technological and ideational, are already working in this domain. The connections between overconsumption, meat eating, and climate damage are evident. That the human population of this planet, in all its formations, are simply supposed to absorb the epidemic as an externality of the business model of meat, and as we've seen last week in Denmark, of intensively farmed mink, expands the violence of its formation to the full surface of the globe. This is a truly hyperscalar calamity with very simple and avoidable causes. Art has means of constructing abundantly rich relations to the world that go beyond this condition through sensing and sense-making. Resources for this can be found in the close affinity with materials and materiality in art. Here, there is a modification that materials are understood to be living forms and substances of expression. We might draw on a number of art historical precedents to think this situation. Contemporarily, the work of artists such as Gediminas and Nomida Urbanus's Futurity Island, making initial attempts at interspecies communication by first enhancing human listening to the sonic landscape. Placing tubes of different widths in a cluster allows for sound waves of different amplitudes to be caught and amplified, generating an organ. The materials for this project are repurposed water pipes. These structures would sometimes be used to drain swamps. Here, instead, as the Urbanuses argue, they advance their complex intermixing on other terrain, that of modified sound. Another artist, Natalie Jeremejenko, has a long-term engagement with art for animals, emphasizing non-human perception as a means of organizing aesthetic experience, is also very much in tune with the ideas expressed here. Designing forms that take hyper-aesthetic awareness as their ground can drive novel public urban forms. One example of this is the butterfly bridge. This lightweight structure consists of a series of bags containing soil, growing butterfly-friendly plants. This encourages the butterflies to move across a road via a route containing food from one patch of ground to another, one patch of flowers to another, rather than flying through traffic. Here, and in other such projects, symbiosis is a conceptual as well as metabolic impetus. The third proposition. The questions of epistemology are closely overlapped with those of technology, especially as that technology moves into the aesthetic domain in terms of feeling, sensation, affect, and detection. It's essential in this condition that art retains intellectual autonomy from the formatting of knowledge and experience by corporations who seek to channel, format, and manipulate it. Here, I want to mention only one issue, although there are many. The question is that of scale, and that's something also touched on by Mamoru Ito and Kazunori Mizushima in the discussion of ICTs. But the specific form of the network is important, and I think here there's an emphasis in which we need to develop a critical vocabulary for software and digital systems as proposed by researchers in software studies and related fields. The present era is partly characterized by the splintering of attempts to provide a planetary information infrastructure. The epistemic politics of this condition is marked by the formation of technologies that work at hyperscale. In a sense, they provide an attempt to preempt and to format and thus harness that hyperesthetic. What does the hyperscale mean? It's a tendency for a technique such as the graph form of mapping social relations. So where every entity is a node and there are links between these nodes. That's what I mean when I talk about the graph form. So this graph form in the hyperscale is to be made operative at multiple scales, such as both between a few friends and between all persons on the planet and every scale in between. The relation between entities in such a graph is described by a mathematical function. Within network analysis, the capacity for such a function to maintain its consistency across scales of calculation within the network is called its eigenvalue. This can be understood to be the idiomatic form of the specific network. So the eigenvalue of Twitter will differ from the eigenvalue of Facebook or Weibo, for instance. The challenge for corporations is to maintain consistency of eigenvalue whilst incorporating as much as possible of the world into their grammar. And this is where the kind of epistemic violence takes place in the kind of translation of the world into this, the function of a particular network graph. In some respects, the nature of an epidemic displays similar patterns of turning bodies towards conformity to a reproductive norm. In this case, though, that of a virus. The possibility of art in this context is rather different. It is to develop and enhance idiomatic operations that move across scale without resorting to a reduction, without being obedient to the function. Art has always been full of means of moving across scale, by analogy, by metaphor, by resemblance. One can think of the way that a classical Japanese garden may borrow in miniature form the outline of the larger horizon in the practice of shakai, for instance, as a kind of example of this. The challenge in the times of COVID is thus very different to innovating a standardized experiential structure. Art's emphasis is very different to a platform, not simply of rolling out the same techniques and equipment across the planet to minimize marginal costs while maximizing market share. Rather, it could be one that works in a diagonal direction, creating transversal relations amongst perspectivalisms and proliferating modes of such movements across scales, such borrowings of unfolding horizon. This means attending to things that don't fit the overarching function, perhaps even multiplying them. At the same time, it might imply articulating art's traditional means of movement across scale with means that allow for forms of solidarity through distance. And this new form of solidarity through distance, of acting together collectively by staying apart from each other, is what characterizes some of the aspects of the epidemic. We can think perhaps of techniques of resonance, where bodies collectively vibrate without directly touching. Such vibration is in common, as at a concert or sound system, in the midst of sound in some other way, but is also differential in that it is received, internalized, and participated in by bodies and movements in idiomatic ways. Such capacities of resonance can also be paralleled by a different dynamic, that of the formation of solidarity in sympathy. And this perhaps relates to some of the questions of care that people have mentioned earlier. Sympathy implies an imaginative openness to transformation of the self that becomes towards some other point or consistency, some other being or state of things that, rather than trying to maintain the sanctity and efficiency of its function, is prepared to fade in its determinants, to receive the blessing of coming into contact with other perspectives and to learn and to be transformed. Art has always been active in creating the subtleties of sympathy, and it is in these that provide its ability to cross scales without demanding conformity. So to conclude, hyperesthetic art recognizes that the world is made up of sensing processes that are deeply imbricated in and arise from its material and conceptual forms. What art can add to it are particular capacities, traditions, and techniques of sense-making. In the condition of the epidemic, which reworks and attacks so many of our notions of physicality, of contact, of sociality, and sensuality, art that attends to and works into the hyperesthetic condition is a precious resource for opening up other conditions of possibility. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now, I would like to ask Ōyama-san to serve as the MC, please. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you.
My name is Shinji. I'm here in Kyoto. I'm an office. Sorry, so my role is okay. I think we have a discussion after our second student, and here we want to a second student, who is a professor of Chinese University of Hong Kong. And obviously, he's in a unique location and its relation to politics and geopolitics zones. I'd like to introduce Professor Anthony and his talk titled COVID-19 and a challenge or an opportunity for local artists, Hong Kong. Over to you, Anthony.
Okay. Thank you, Shinji. So should I share my PowerPoint first? Let me share my PowerPoint. Let's see. Let's see if it works.
I think your microphone is muted. Professor Fung, could you unmute your microphone, please?
Is it okay? Good. Is it good? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yoshi. Thank you, the Post Media Network Research Group. I'm really feel honored and to speak in this occasion. We have been separated from the rest of the world for too long because of the COVID-19. Yeah, that's why I would like to share my view with the public about the local scenes, especially local artist scenes. My topic, my presentation topic is COVID-19 and art, a challenge or an opportunity for local artists in Hong Kong. My presentation is less theoretical, like comparing to all the speakers like speaking before. Mine is actually a kind of capture of the local phenomenon, local arts phenomenon, or more or less a kind of cultural critique to globalization in Hong Kong, especially in the realm of arts. So, and I will explain that as I talk more about it. Hong Kong has been always seen as a international hub for global arts. And Hong Kong has been like doing Art Basel in Hong Kong since 2013. And they're always report saying that like how many tourists, how many visitors are attracted to Hong Kong because of arts. So like there's a figure here, like in 2019, 40,000 visitors came for Art Basel with 242 galleries from 35 countries. That is the kind of discourse of local art scenes in Hong Kong. Having said that, like I said, local art scenes in Hong Kong are in fact like more like a kind of global art scenes. As I described here, in fact, what the whole Art Basel in Hong Kong, in fact, doesn't really emphasize the kind of local arts and local art scenes. And there are, in fact, many art fairs in Hong Kong, and most of them emphasize the Asian and international nature of the Hong Kong arts. First of all, there's the Art Central, which you can see on the photo, and which is located in the middle of the town, as you can see in the picture. And there's also the Asia Contemporary Art Show, and the Affordable Art Fair. And the Affordable Art Fair is becoming more and more popular. As you can tell on this picture, most of these art fairs are actually targeting the more elite class in Hong Kong. And they are more educated, they are of the higher socio-economic status. They are actually like, most of them are situated on the Hong Kong island. As you can see, it's the commercial district. And most of them, like who can really afford to buy arts, like these bankers, the rich businessmen, merchants, and so forth. Besides that, there are auctions hosted in Hong Kong, like by world-leading auction houses like Sotheby's, Christie's, Bonhams, and Phillips. All these are actually global agents, like operating in Hong Kong in terms of like selling arts. There's also a very unique Hong Kong culture. I call it Hong Kong shopping mall culture. This is, if I use the term of capitalism, I think this is a kind of like hyper capitalism that we can find in Hong Kong. All the famous shopping malls, like mostly like these high brand, these like really expensive luxury brands, are actually situated in this like shopping mall. This is one of the more called Taikoo Place. And arts is always integrated as part of this commercial and highly capitalized activities. So whenever like those kind of rich people go to this shopping mall, and they would also enjoy a taste of arts. So that's why like arts and shopping culture is actually put by side in Hong Kong always. I want to show you another picture, which is a new development in Hong Kong. And on the top left corner, you can see this is a new shopping mall in Hong Kong. It's called K11 Museum. And on the top right corner is the inside of the shopping mall. It's a highly decorated environment with a lot of contemporary and postmodern arts, like actually put like in between shopping malls. And on the top of these shopping malls, you can see there's a rooftop. The rooftop actually like accommodate a lot of big like exhibits. Like on the bottom left corner, you can see this is one of the exhibits. Currently, in fact, K11 Museum is doing a kind of an exhibit called Van Gogh Year. You can see that the year on the bottom. In fact, and that is a way to actually promote arts more or less in the same period. In fact, I went to this shopping mall a few days ago. What impressed me is that inside these shopping malls, they are not actually putting really this kind of arts that people don't really know. In fact, they actually is a collection of arts all over the world. And you can see there's a circle here. The circle is actually a large exhibit by Damien Hirst. In fact, this is a kind of if you can like see clearly, these are butterflies. Actually, he put all the butterflies into these exhibits and becomes an exhibition like signifying and symbolizing death and life. So like imagine like when you go to the shopping mall, you are also at the same time immersed into a kind of arts culture. And these arts, as I go along and I talk about, they are always international art, global arts. And at the same time, Hong Kong is also like putting together a lot of arts-related institutions, and they are probably some of the really famous ones in Asia. The first one is called Tai Kwun Center for Heritage and Arts. And as you can see on the bottom left corner, it was a kind of British colonial architecture. It was actually the police headquarters in Hong Kong, and is now converted into a place for like arts exhibits. And there's also the Parasite, which has been running for 20 years, and there are like Asian Arts Archive and Asian Society Hong Kong Center, which focus more on Asian arts. As I go along, I didn't talk anything about the local arts. Like at most, there's Asia, right? And there's also the Center for Heritage Arts and Textile, sponsored by the Music Foundation. And then you can see that on the bottom right corner, is a kind of a factory converted art scenes, and this is one of the most popular art scenes in Hong Kong. And for a lot of the exhibition there, it's also they also focus more on so-called global arts. And Hong Kong, as always, selling its international image and always celebrate its as an international finance center. So they always compare it to other global cities. And for these all global cities, they are actually having this kind of image of us as a kind of icon. So like Hong Kong has like newly renovated the Museum of Arts. They call it Hong Kong MoMA. You can probably know that this is more or less close to the New York's MoMA. And on the right side, you can see the newly developed West Kowloon Cultural District, and Hong Kong is building this so-called one of the most famous and expensive museum in the world. It's called M+ Museum, and now Hong Kong actually is collecting all international arts. They actually buying all the arts around the world. So then now then suddenly there is COVID-19. Then everyone asks the same question: what is loss under the COVID-19? Then a lot of people, well, especially those people who are they're really like passionate about art. They always talk about, well, now all the formal art fairs and auctions has been closed and terminated. And the art galleries, all the art galleries in Hong Kong are also closed because of the the government's announcement. And there's also the first thing is stopped is about the kind of art-related community activities and education. What is it about? In fact, I show you a picture of so-called CJC, a cultural journalism campus, which is an NGO, a non-profit NGO in Hong Kong, that tries to relate art and culture to the public through cultural journalism. In fact, I'm one of the directors of this CJC. We start this CJC because we want to relate Art Basels to the Hong Kong public. In fact, we are sponsored by Art Basel almost every year to cover what is Art Basel. To talk deeply more about that. In fact, we not only want to relate Art Basel to those people who like art, we want to relate Art Basel to the layman. In fact, for most of the people in Hong Kong, they don't know about Art Basel, or they know that Art Basel is really far from them. In terms of this cultural taste and the kind of affordability of art in Art Basels. So that's why CJC was set up to try to popularize like arts in Hong Kong and try to make Hong Kong people know more about arts, not just about Art Basels. And under this COVID-19, it seems that this Hong Kong's global connectivity has not been stopped. And also the kind of circulation of arts in Hong Kong has not been stopped. Although Art Basel has announced that they would not have the face-to-face exhibition in Hong Kong. Art Basel is still doing a kind of online virtual exhibition. So this is one of the Art Basel online viewing room. You can see the Michelle Innes and Nash galleries of Katy Perry's Cloud9 here. As you can see, you can tell on the picture, these are really, this postmodern art, it's high art. Some images or imaginaries and or discourses of the artists created like in other parts of the world, and they are not part of the Hong Kong scenes. So when I say and under COVID-19, they are still holding this kind of exhibition. I would say probably want to make the argument is that the internet actually perpetuates this kind of global circulation of arts into Hong Kong, and also the kind of global commerce of arts in Hong Kong. So it's more a kind of like perpetuation of capitalism under COVID-19. So there's a New York Times also report about this kind of virtual exhibition, and it emphasized that Art Basel in Hong Kong actually presented more than 2,000 works online with an estimated value of 270 million. And so that's why when we talk about the art scenes in Hong Kong, it's always about the money, about capitalism. And this is always the image of Hong Kong and in the eyes of the public. So what's actually for the local people, what is lost in COVID-19 is not really about the loss of Art Basel. In fact, most of the people don't go to the Art Basel. It's the loss of voices for the local people. And as you can, this is an exhibition of a a collective. We call it Hong Kong Arts Collective, and it's a organization that tries to emphasize or re-emphasize the importance of local artists. And they also try to do more or less the same thing. They create online platform for artists, exhibition, and events, and even they create a minute VR for the exhibition in March. As you can tell in this picture, that lady wearing the mask in Hong Kong, in fact, shows more about the kind of fear, precarious condition, and the kind of inequality of the people who suffer from COVID-19. But this kind of main themes, as you can tell in the last picture, was not actually emphasized in the global arts at all. So at this point, I would say that there's a kind of disjuncture between the local art scenes and the global circulation of arts through Hong Kong. And Hong Kong's art collective is always separated or segregated from the rest of the world. And when Hong Kong talks about Hong Kong as a global hub of arts, it doesn't really refer to the Hong Kong art scenes at all. And this is quite sad about it. So that's why I always have the questions, what are the meanings of these art scenes for Hong Kong people? Hong Kong celebrates its image as a kind of global city for global arts. And there are actually 53 galleries, big galleries listed under the Hong Kong Art Gallery Association in 2020. And every year they have kind of exhibition and walk through all the exhibitions. And most of these exhibits are also about global arts, Asian arts. So like, as you can tell, some of the galleries in Hong Kong actually have the title of Asia. So Hong Kong, besides having this kind of image of global arts, is also selling this image of Asian art. But then I have this more critical question: is globality favoring local arts or just local circulation of global arts or the regional markets? In that sense, this globality of arts do not really serve the local purpose and don't really address the local concern at all. It's more or less a kind of representation of capitalism in Hong Kong and through Hong Kong. And arts is a kind of means for them to circulate this kind of capital, and not just cultural capital, but also real capitals as well. And so I want to make actually 2 points here, 2 propositions perhaps. The first one is office. I want to talk about, in fact, the importance of local independent artists. And there are, in fact, certain galleries that are devoted to them. There are at least, I actually have mentioned 4 examples. These are the first one, as you can see, the name of the galleries are up there. There's the 1A Space, the Bamboo Scenes, Gallery Exit, Blind Spot Galleries. They are actually the galleries just or exclusively designed for local art scenes. In fact, that this is a kind of more or less a kind of local movement that address the kind of importance of local arts against the kind of global arts movement. And actually before the COVID-19, nobody actually people, the major social discourse or the media discourse are always on Art Basel and these global exhibitions. But as local artists, as the global artists, as the global tourists, as those tourists cannot come to Hong Kong during the COVID-19, most of those people who are going to these galleries are actually locals. And this is the first time where the locals can find their own voices and expressions through these kind of local exhibitions. When the so-called the more international exhibition are actually absent in Hong Kong. So ironically, the so-called decline of global art scenes in Hong Kong brings to some life, some more vivid scenes of the local artists in Hong Kong. This is also the second point that I'm going to make. In fact, when we always talk about arts, we always talk about this high arts. And as I mentioned, there's the K11 Museum, and all the arts collected in the shopping malls, more or less the global arts, postmodern arts. In fact, nobody actually talk about the local arts form. In fact, the COVID-19 also is an opportunity for us to reconsider what is the local arts forms. Are they those exhibits by Damien Hirst, or in fact, there are the pictures of Van Gogh? My answer is probably I'm more like in echo with a lot of local artists. This on the PowerPoint, this is a picture of my friend who is a local artist. What was local arts for them? In fact, the Hong Kong local arts is always in connection with the popular culture in Hong Kong or the Hong Kong cinema. So in fact, and my friend in fact is a kind of Hong Kong comic artist, and he is more actually well known for the common people. However, his exhibit is never happen in this, so never can go into so-called the Hong Kong Museum. So Hong Kong Museum is not a kind of representation of arts. It's more not a representation of local arts. It's more a representation of global arts and arts that are highly circulated worldwide with values on it. This capital side, this like more like cash value on it. And also like Hong Kong also sometimes circulate a lot of local popular culture in China as well. On the right side, this is a more or less a kind of local art scenes in China. What is local art scene in China? In fact, they are also coming from the kind of popular culture in China. In fact, this character is one of the characters described in the online fiction in one of the Chinese website. And these arts, these more layman arts, are more circulated like on the internet through like this kind of local website, as well as by this kind of local young people. Whereas those kind of more like these grand arts, these great big exhibitions are always celebrated by this kind of highly educated elite class in the world. So the kind of art scene in Hong Kong actually reflects a kind of a gap between the local people and the rich people, and it is a kind of reflection of the local taste as well. So to conclude, I would like to say that in fact, when COVID-19 temporarily stopped this kind of so-called global visitors and stop at least the kind of opening of this global art scenes in Hong Kong, it actually brings together some local art scenes and give some air for them to breathe and have some opportunities for the local artists to highlight what are the real concerns for Hong Kong's. So my presentation is more or less a kind of critical thoughts about the global arts in Hong Kong, and COVID-19 is actually a period where we can actually reconsider this situation in Hong Kong, probably in other parts of Asia as well. Maybe I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. We have about 47 minutes left for discussion. I think we need to. We need a short break, right? Maybe 5 minutes. 野森さん、大丈夫ですかね
5分だけ、5
Is that
minutes.
okay? Yes, 5 minutes.
8:13 on my watch. So we come back to resume the sessions at 8:18. Okay. Sorry, I have to run to that room. each of us will give 2 minutes comment to the two speakers. And then after that, we go into a proper, not proper discussions. I think I should start. I'm a chair, and I think I should start. Well, I think two speakers are very interesting in their own ways. But as opposed to addressing each of them directly, I think I want to ask a very basic question, which is that, well, this is post-media research network. And we basically been thinking about this, transformations in ecology, media ecology, mostly in terms of relationship between old media and digital new media. When we talk about COVID-19, this pandemic, as far as Japan is concerned, we are, seeing, I think, I guess, persistent significance and impact of all media, particularly televisions. And I think as far as Japan is concerned, digital media, Twitter and Yahoo comments and Nico Nico Doga and the likes, have not been offering alternative space, in terms of challenging dominant discourse and, offering different ways of talking about this pandemic. I think the situation is different country by country. But I guess as far as this science is concerned, China and Japan, the situations, in terms of number of deaths, number of infections, so on, is different from the UK, is different from Europe. But basically, television and this media ecology is producing this discourse that this is, well, I should stop here. But my question is this relationship between old media and digital media, and how we think about the political economy of it, and so on. So that's my comment to speaker. You must have different situations in the UK and in Hong Kong. So I think we are going back to Ito Sensei for 2 minutes comment to the two speakers. Ito Sensei,お願いします。
So today, to everyone who gave us reports, I would like to say that I received a lot of wonderful insights. And to everyone, I want to comment to everyone, but we have time restraints. So today, I would like to comment to Matthew-san and Mizushima-san's reports, because I felt a lot of empathy for what they had to say, and I would like to comment. Now, Matthew, at the beginning of his report, he talked about Pissarro, the artist. And rephrasing what he had to say, how should I put this? Life. From the perspective of life, how do you look at your target? From the perspective of life, he talked about the issue of sensing. And currently, including COVID-19, the virus, the natural environment, including the various changes in the environment through technology, we are getting to learn about the current situation. And this, regarding the external environment like the air, or the soil quality, or the seas, or the rivers. Regarding this external environment, it's not only sensing, but regarding the virus too, regarding the human body. To rephrase this, the internal ecology too, through technology, we are able to have new understanding. That's what I think he was saying. However, this data is not just mechanical data, it's we ourselves. From a biological viewpoint, how do we view this? For us human beings, changes in our understanding or changes in the way we are itself is being put to the question. I think from Matthew-san's report, I think this is the biggest important point. And personally, in my report, I talked about Guattari. Briefly, I touched on him. And that report says that Guattari says what the machines can give us is indeed a gift. It's a present. That perspective and that came to mind. Guattari, through the three ecologies, says that our understanding of the natural environment is the external environment and the recognition of the internal environment and the social understanding and our mental state. All of these are linked together. So it's directly linked to these three ecologies issue. And at that time, so there's the uncertainty of the external environment and the uncertainty of the internal environment. And so this should be seen as an opportunity. So Matthew was saying there's another different direction. So through our changes in our understanding, we will create a new normal. So that was the vector of what he had to say about art. And I listened and I thought, I feel exactly the same way. And turning to Mizushima-san, she talked about surveillance. And I also felt a lot of surveillance, a lot of empathy as I listened. And Ms. Mizushima was saying the problem of surveillance. She said, surveillance is evil. Or, he says, or surveillance through new words. How is that working? He touched on this in great depth. And this, me too, in my report, I wanted to point that out. That was one of the things I wanted to touch on today. And at that time, what I now think is important is, Mōri-san talked about artists. He says they're not just individual art creators of art, but they have to show care for others, and through their care, he suggested a new role for artists as caregivers. And actually, we too, regarding technology, so there's a lot of specialist technology, and then there are the users of the technology, the elderly people, or the general citizens. And serving as coordinators, serving as caregivers, to explain how to use the machines. And we want to pay attention to the concept of design. And through this, Mizushima-san, how do you think we should work on this? And regarding machines, in order to create this, what kind of technologies is he planning to design? I hope to hear more from Professor Mizushima regarding this. I think I spoke more than 3 minutes, but that's all from myself. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I was the only one who didn't realize that the comment is for all 5 speakers, not just the 2 keynotes in the second session. 清水先生、お願いします。
はい。私も皆さんの発表本当に
Well,
たくさん
as I was listening, I was also inspired, and it's going to be very difficult to say everything that I felt in just 2 minutes. But Anthony, the last presenter, I had a question. It was a very interesting presentation, and so thank you very much. And one thing that came to mind was in Hong Kong, the coronavirus, since COVID-19 started and as it spread, and also this political tension with mainland China, I believe these two periods overlapped with each other. So, and then you have the global versus local arts being rethought once again, and I believe that was a big challenge. So, what the mass media reporting and also the local artists' role as media, how they showed things and expressed things, were there any gaps or discrepancies between the two, between the local artists and the mass media? So that's my question to you. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。じゃあ、Professor Mizushima, please.
はい、すいません。結構お腹が空いてきて、ぼーっとして。
I'm sorry, I was not concentrated because I'm a bit hungry, but Professor Ito just asked me a question, so let me briefly answer. It's difficult to answer that question, but how to look at the common. Felix Guattari's the concept of mechanism is very important in looking at the common. Guattari sees the mechanism as the connection between the mechanical parts as well as the interaction between people, but at the same time, the interaction of elements, both human and non-human, they are placed in the playing field, and then he looked at the synthesis of all these elements. So if I can use this as the common, then it is the question of how to connect the media and other elements. So the time was quite limited today, but the 21st century fascism, what does it mean? It is another big question that we need to answer. During the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in March, the concern was, especially in Japan, was that this may be utilized by politicians, the authoritarian politician, and they may declare a state of emergency. This concern was shared in March. And Giorgio Agamben, an Italian scholar, also talked about this in a very short sentence. And it may have been quite natural, but for example, President Trump and President Bolsonaro of Brazil, and previous Prime Minister Abe and current Prime Minister Suga, these authoritarian politicians were hesitant to declare a state of emergency. So I think that that's something that we need to think about. So there was an analogy using wars, but the COVID-19 pandemic is not about the friends and enemy. It is a disaster that is beyond that relationship, which means that the care as a collectivity is important. But on the other hand, when it comes to capitalism, we need to look at individuals as separate entities. So in the COVID-19 pandemic, it is not ideal to have the collectivity. That is why Bolsonaro, Trump, and Abe and Suga, these leaders, were reluctant to declare a state of emergency. In other words, Agamben's left-wing power is similar to the extreme right in the U.S. So what is the form of the fascism in the 21st century? That is what we need to consider as we talk about post-media. And I think a lot of insights were provided by the presenters today, especially as Professor Mōri said, the art and politics issue and art and capitalism issue. These new and old issues are emerging once again. And Matthew talked about a new form of solidarity. It is difficult to be together physically, but how to create solidarity as we distance ourselves is important. So we need to go beyond scale through art. In that sense, art may play a big role. So the articulation of politics and art, I think Matthew gave us a great insight on that. And Anthony also made a report on Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a very unique location from the perspective of capitalism. So the tension between the global and local and the issue of capitalism, I think that specific examples were presented by Anthony, and I listened to the presentation with great interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have Mori-san responding to the other talk.
はい、どうもありがとうございます。
Yes, thank you. So I thought 3 hours would be really long before we started, but it's already been 2.5 hours. It went by like a flash. So that shows how interesting the discussions were. So I would like to ask the keynote speakers 2 questions each or 2 comments each. First, Matthew's presentation was very interesting. And today, we were unable to talk too much about hyper-aesthetic art. The definition, we were not able to touch on this. Simplistically speaking, in the past, what was called aesthetic. So this is, we want to go back to the classic definition. This is sense or sensory. It's a part of sensitivity. We wanted to rethink aesthetics as part of that. And in contemporary art, for example, seeing, listening, it's quite specialized. But the sense of smell or taste or maybe touching, the sense of touch, how do we get those back? I think those were all involved. Or emotions. But with COVID-19, one big characteristic is, through COVID-19, we are going to lose our sense of smell or taste. And even if you don't have COVID-19, in our world, linked through the internet, there's a lot of virtual reality that's developing, but our sense of, it's limited to our sense of hearing and seeing. So how, in a classical sense of the word, do we try to get something like hyper-aesthetics? How do we get that back? I wanted to hear your outlook about this. It's very attractive, but because it's attractive, right now, with our current technology, we are unable to keep up. And the other, for example, by changing our senses, our physical senses, and the relationship with communism. So I quoted from Benjamin, and he talks about this as well. It's talked about in a variety of places. And Matthew, what you are thinking of, a new kind of sensitivity, aesthetics, and specifically regarding the political format. Is it communism or is it something completely different? Leaving that aside, but the political format and accompanying that, the economic format. What's the relationship between the three? How do you define that relationship between the three? So will all three change at the same time? And in a classical sense of the word, is there going to be like a revolution that cuts things off, or is that not so? Is it going to be the sensitivity, the senses, and a reform or a change or a revolution of the senses first, and then after that, is there going to be like a political change, or are they not mutually related? If you could maybe talk about that. And Anthony, so you were unique to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is not China. I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but regarding Hong Kong, So Hong Kong and at the same time China. But Hong Kong's uniqueness was visible. It was very interesting. And regarding the local artists, what is local? I was interested in that. For example, as a Hong Kong person, you have your identity as a Hong Kongese. Or, in a different sense of the word, like made in China, you are Chinese. Is that involved as well? What does it mean to be local? And when you think about global, how do you define the localness of local artists or the local audience? For example, not high art, more like manga, pop culture, audiences who like those. So what's their localness? Specifically, how do you define local? Hong Kong, China, global, or in Hong Kong? Are there more detailed differences? How do you position all of them? And how do you position local? That's all from myself.
Some of the questions have been directly addressed to you. We are about 20 minutes left. We have to leave the venue 9 o'clock sharp. So you probably have 8 to 10 minutes to address questions that's been directed for you. So Matthew, please.
I think your microphone is muted.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been incredibly interesting to hear people's different papers and responses. I think, and the different kinds of questions that these pose. How do we form a kind of aesthetics in the present that undergirds and informs art practices, but also recognizes the way in which aesthetics moves well beyond art practices. But art practice has a very specific and very privileged way of reformatting, reworking and understanding aesthetics in a way that can intensify it, make it broader, spread it in different ways. So one of the things that when we're talking about hyperesthetics, we're interested in this idea of aesthetics as both sensing and sense making. So that it's about the kind of phenomenal act of sensing, but it's also sense making in the sense that we reflect on sensing and reason with it, so that it's a form of intellectual reflective activity as well as purely phenomenal. And sense making also involves in the present, and this is a particularly artistic thing as well as a technical thing, the making of senses, that is kind of augmentation of senses through the production of senses, through the production of artworks, through the production of collective capacities of knowing. And this relates in a sense to the question of what is the political dimension of this. In order to make senses, in order to make sense, we have to develop discourses, develop institutions, develop organizations, develop means of collective working on sense. And this always, as well as an epistemic operation of reason, always has a collective dimension of producing formations of knowing, whether they're art fairs, local art organizations, or aesthetic commons. And we argue that the aesthetic commons is the kind of ground for a new kind of politics. And the grounds are formed through the way in which reality itself, like the function of reality, is to produce a commons which we rework. So access to this reality through epistemic processes, through science, through art, through social formations, is the basis of our common existence on the planet. And therefore, as people have mentioned, this Guattarian dimension of ecology is the foundation of aesthetic practice. So that in order to think about aesthetic change and political change, we need to think about what are the grounds for sense making? Where does sense making occur, and whether that it occurs now in multiple technical systems, millions of sensors, millions of devices, millions of processes, but it's also something that happens in plants, in animals, in viruses that are sensing the possibility of entering an organism in a membrane. So the construction of spaces and processes, dynamics of sense making is really crucial to this. And looking at the different talks, it seemed to me that one of the things that was interesting that crossed a few of them was this idea that one way of linking them would be the idea of the filter as something that allows one to perceive something in the way that, say, when you wear sunglasses on a sunny day, it filters out light, you're able to see the world better. But the filter can also be something in digital signal processing. We've seen Instagram filters that modify people's faces. Filters are also found in masks that filter the air, but also semiotic filtering and filterings of power, and also in Anthony's discussion, filters of different asset classes. So art in Hong Kong has worked for some as an asset class because it works as a means of avoiding tax in certain ways. By being stored in warehouses in Hong Kong, art is able to escape the kind of regimes of tax that would be applied to it in PRC. So there's multiple levels of filter that are operative, and these filters, I would argue, are sensual. A tax regime, we can say, is a sensing process, sense-making process at the same time. And it seems that what we're looking at now is, in aesthetics, a globally ramified hyper-aesthetics of filtering of what is included into a polity, a politics, what is included into an organism and what is outside of it, and what also filters can do in order to amplify and intensify and not simply beautify certain kinds of aesthetic perception and process. Okay, so I'd like to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Anthony, we have a thought responding to some of the questions or the talks more generally.
Yeah,
Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. First of all, I would like to respond to Tomoko's question. I think Tomoko actually asked the right question for the Hong Kong, and she's asking whether the local artists actually have the same view with the local media. Exactly. She addressed the point. In fact, the local media, we put it in a way that the term that we use, the local media is always under the surveillance of the government, surveillance of the Chinese government. So the local media are not really actually talking about the viewpoint of the people. Instead, they're talking about the viewpoint of the authorities. And using like the term aesthetic as well. The local media always emphasize the aesthetic defined by the society, defined by Hong Kong's international position. That's why when we say global arts is the Hong Kong arts, and this is a definition more or less described in the local media. But exactly, this is actually excludes the local voices. The local artists precisely want to address the unsaid voices of the people. That is, in fact, they have the local aesthetics. Popular culture for them may be part of the arts, but they are not actually included in the museum and all. And talking about these political viewpoints, the local media always celebrate the local viewpoints. But so that's why we only through these local artists can we see a kind of other Hong Kong histories. This is not just about arts. As when we say I talk about Hong Kong cinema, talking about Canto pop, they are all the same. All these like popular cultural forms as well as the art forms always in Hong Kong's are being said as the other histories or other versions of Hong Kong. So they are highly important, and so that's why they are really different from the so-called the local media. And the second question is from Shinji. Shinji asked about the differences between old media and the new media. The old media, as I said, are the media actually being under the surveillance of the governments. And we always have the hope that these new medias, new like the platforms, this kind of internet, VR, actually will bring new hopes to the local people. But actually they are not. And as I demonstrate, in fact, the new media like the VR things, the virtual exhibition, always has been used as an extension or amplification of the existing status quo or the existing circulation of global arts, global commerce in capitalism in Hong Kong. So and the new media actually don't really bring new opportunities for the local artists, and so that's why the local artists actually decide to use their own ways. The local artists, the really local artists, return to the really old media local exhibition hall in a certain alley to do their own work. And I think, and then I want to respond to Yoshi's question. I think Yoshi's question is always my question in my writing. What is really local? I try to think about. Actually, I wrote about that briefly in my PhD studies of so-called the local identity of Hong Kong. What is local? Quite unfortunately, is always defined as the otherness of global. That is what we have a lot of like probably a lot of research article, a lot of books, volume, edited like anthologies on globalization. So we actually know more about globalization than anything else. When we talk about global, in fact, we always say that, oh, this is the other side of so-called global, but we really don't really address the complicated problem of the local. In fact, local is a more, if I have to describe what is local. I think local is a kind of cultural condition, very specific to some of the people in a geographical region. And that cultural condition can be really complex, and it varies from one place to the others. Talking about Hong Kong, like politically, some of the artists might actually in fact, most of the artists in Hong Kong are like, they are Chinese, ethnic Chinese. Maybe some of them actually are descendants of Chinese, from China. On the one hand, they have the cultural roots in China. On the other hand, they also absorb the kind of so-called the so-called global values, always like something like equality, human rights, democracy, and so forth. And local people always survive in this kind of like multicultural or co-survived like Chinese culture and global culture in Hong Kong. And this is always the cultural condition is always a compromise. Compromise in terms of political values, in terms of aesthetics as well. So that like when we actually look at the one of the pictures I show you, in fact, the local artists actually create a lot of really interesting work. Say, for example, they actually use the Western techniques of painting, but actually they also combine it with the Chinese calligraphy. So the Chinese calligraphy have a lot of white things behind, and they leave a lot of empty space. So they combine this kind of so-called global aesthetic forms and the local culture as well. So the local is always the gathered part when we actually celebrate the globals. In particular, in this pandemic, in the COVID-19 era, we always emphasize the kind of impact of COVID-19 of the world, and we try to always emphasize that the kind of global solution, like finding the vaccine or something like that. But really, we don't really go into say what is a local problem, like in say in India when we have this COVID-19, and how is it different from the local problems of Hong Kong under the pandemic. In fact, Hong Kong's pandemic is actually Tomoko actually mentioned that the COVID-19 seems to be a kind of excuse for us, for a lot of local people, not to referring back to the China-Hong Kong tensions that happened last year, and the local media helped to shape this kind of like discourse as well. So I guess when we want to talk more about the local, we really have to describe more or come together a more thick description of the local cultural condition. That's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Okay, we have exactly 5 minutes. Anyone has doesn't have to be concluding, but final thought on what we have discussed tonight? Mori-san, would you like to give a final thought, comment as conceptual aspect of this symposium?
どちらにしてももうあと5分しかない。
In any case, we only have 5 more minutes, so we cannot start another theme in our discussion. But I guess we were a bit too ambitious in planning this event. We should have allocated a full day for the symposium, but we packed all these contents in three hours. So that is my mistake. Oh, I have talked to many people, but in February, we would like to have a big symposium. We discussed a lot of things today, especially Matthew and Anthony. We wanted to talk about a lot more comments on their keynote speeches, but we'd like to talk about them in other occasions. So next time, we might have a closed discussion rather than having an event like today, like an open event like today's. So the interpreters are only available for 3 hours until 9 p.m. The interpreters did a good job, I think. So there is still frustration, but unfortunately, this event was only for a very short period of time.
Matthew and Anthony, thank you very much for participating in this conference. I think I was too ambitious then, so we need more time to discuss. So probably we will have a more kind of intimate, probably closed workshop together to ask more questions and exchange some ideas. And as I said before, that I'm hoping to organize a next round in February, and invite some people, more people, and to have this sort of online conference too. So, so I hope you again to come back and to continue the discussion. So thank you very much indeed, and then it's time to finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
そちらもうばらさなきゃいけないんですか、すぐ。
いや、撮影はまだいいので、一回放送を切って、
the live streaming, and we need to release the interpreters. But we can have some after talk in a closed environment.